welcome to the Visions podcast. This is our 5th episode in Expertise Unlocked. And the format of the show is about bringing different perspectives together on a common theme to really kind of blow open that topic and see how different opinions shape different decision making and problem solving. And today, the theme is about group dynamics in the boardroom. And I'm delighted by the 2 guests I have with me today. Very, very different perspectives. So I have one who represents the theory of group dynamics and decision making, and one who represents many, many years in many boardrooms all over the world. So a proper introduction would be, I have Patrick Walker, who has worked and lived in many different countries. He was started off as a journalist, then he worked for quite a lot of the big tech companies, establishing new teams, new divisions, and recently he's turned a serial entrepreneur, has a very successful app on the App Store in the EdTech section. So welcome, Patrick.
Thank you very much.
And I have Irina Cojuharenco, who is a career academic who has many years of research and teaching in decision-making, problem-solving, and group dynamics. So, and myself, just to introduce myself, I have many years at the intersection between games, media, and psychology, and now set up a company that brings together diverse entrepreneurs to solve strategic challenges for businesses using diversity of thought. So welcome today. I suppose I originally thought about this theme because back in December, there was all sorts of crazy things going on in boardrooms with OpenAI. And since then, we've had the post office fraud scandal in the UK as well, which both of those episodes show that what can go wrong in a boardroom environment. So that sort of drove us today. So on the back of that, Irina, I don't know whether you want to start with what is the perfect group dynamic for a board?
Welcome, a warm welcome to our audience as well. Thank you for inviting me. And that's a very tough question to begin our conversation with. But if we are to think about perfect group dynamics, I would see there are several dimensions of group dynamics to it. One having to do with people who meet as part of a group or a team becoming a performative team, right? So going through their own stages of getting to know each other and storming their roles and purpose and what they're going to do together. And reaching the point of clarity that allows them to perform. And the other kind of dynamic, I suppose, unravels in relation to the particular decision-making or problem-solving task that they tackle. And, you know, I run many simulations of group decision-making in classrooms in various disciplines that I teach that are leadership and decision-making related disciplines, and a lot of time and effort is typically invested in helping the group come together as a team, and then a lot of learning happens in relation to how to structure the decision-making or the problem-solving process itself once you are a team ready to perform.
So Patrick, from your experience, this point about kind of familiarity and skill sets, what would you say you've noticed as being sort of healthy dimensions in that environment?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I've looked at it from the perspective of being the CEO of also as a non-executive director, also as an observer and an investor, and I've seen quite a few different iterations, sort of the good, the bad, and the ugly as well, in my experience. And what I find, and the ones that I find thrive the most, are ones where, it's like a vibrant ecosystem where you have a lot of diversity of thoughts. Everybody has a voice and is actively engaged. you have lively debates. People aren't afraid to speak their voice, and people hold each other accountable. Each one in the room actually has a clear responsibility, or some areas of expertise where people look to them for their input, and having that be both diverse and actively infused into the discussion is super helpful. I've seen examples where it's quite the opposite. Unhealthy boards can get stuck in sort of groupthink. People are quite passive, lacking transparency. Oftentimes it's just looking for a rubber stamp, or the board basically assumes everything's okay for whatever reason. They've got other things going on. The executives are just trying to get through and give the updates and power through certain areas. But in doing so, even in most cases, if there's no real problem, it does create a space where real problems can be missed because there's not an attention to detail and holding particularly the executives to account for what they're presenting. Especially when things are tough, some executives tend to slink towards, I would say, overly optimistic thinking, and not being really, I would say, nothing to do with their intentions. It's really more they just maybe don't have the discipline to be super conservative and cautious, particularly when you're dealing with shareholder groups, other people's money, and your employees, I think. And so that's critical. So on one hand, healthy, vibrant, diverse, dynamic, people are held accountable. The other side is, groupthink, oftentimes a little bit of even bullying I've seen in these cases as well. And in the worst case, I've seen even, I would see, quite unethical behavior where people are making decisions outside the boardroom and they're coming in looking to get things through and sort of powering through decisions that aren't necessarily in the best interest of the employees, the shareholders, the customers.
Arguably, when you were talking about this sort of dynamism and the diversity of thought, it sounds to me like those happen in the smaller company scenarios, whereas when you talk about the kind of making decisions outside the boardroom, maybe the bullying so that everybody just agrees, that tends to happen at the sort of bigger organizations. Or am I wrong?
Well, I think there's certain dynamics where if it's a really big organization, particularly if the one in control has the ability to push things through without needing consensus, then yes. And I think we've seen interesting examples of this. Great failures. Either it was the charisma and people feeling a lack of confidence in challenging that person because they're on the cover of Forbes or whatever they are. I think Theranos, WeWork, etc. Or they actually have full control and it's more of a rubber stamping dynamic, and certain things are not raised. They're surrounded by yes men and women, and therefore this is particularly when that sort of power becomes too great, then mistakes can be made, and people that get kind of into I told you so mode without having created the environment where that won't occur.
I just want to also raise the issue of competence and skills of decision-making skills of people mattering as well, because sometimes how does it go? This saying that don't mistake for evil something that's merely the result of incompetence. I increasingly appreciate that insight, and my students also attest to the fact that learning about problem solving and decision making helps them behave very differently in situations like this. So naive approaches to decision making sometimes enable chaos and enable biases, and more better informed approaches where people understand that, for example, key to your process should be an explicit discussion of goals and objectives and criteria for the types of solutions you want to achieve, the criteria for success you'd like to see, and that you want to agree with other people who bring their own agendas to the table. And so clarity about the goals and criteria then helps groups develop the courses of actions that would help them achieve those goals, and decide which courses of actions are helpful and which should be discarded, and whether they have or do not have sufficient alternatives that they are considering toward in the pursuit of a particular goal. You know, those early stages of decision making, of having those types of clarity are quite important. And if decision makers at the table don't invest in having the conversations that help them achieve that clarity of objective and different courses of actions that they are putting on the table, then the rest of the process is basically undermined in terms of the evaluation of particular consequences of a particular course of action, right? So I often bring the example of telling my son whether he would like blue or red pajama before going to bed, as a decision that I frame for him. And how then it takes critical reasoning on his behalf to tell me, I don't want to go to bed to begin with. I want to watch TV. That shows us the criticality of problem formulation in any group decision-making process. And if you allow for problems to be formulated for you, and you do not critically examine how problems are posed, and what alternative courses of action therefore are available in the pursuit of a particular goal, then you're already setting yourself up for not a very productive dynamic in group decision making.
Like so often in a board environment that I've been in, there isn't the genuine decision-making exercise that Irina's just talked about. Everything's been shortcut and very, very sort of narrowly funneled, so that you usually are making a choice of two different things, or this sort of genuinely looking actually at whether this is a problem that should be discussed in the first place, or even having an alternative of not doing anything. I don't know, how structured do you think it often is?
Yeah, I've seen examples where it has been a very genuine dialogue where real decisions have been made, but it took a lot of prep prior so that you could have that conversation. For example, you do the work, you prepare your slides, you maybe outline the scenario, and then you give three potential choices that could be made, and the cost benefit of each, and then you can actually have a robust, meaningful conversation, and then you leave open the possibility of something that we didn't consider, we would love for you to discuss. And it's even better if that is sent to the board members prior to the meeting, so they have time to consider. They have time to even query and ask questions prior to coming in, so that you're not starting from a place of let's actually learn about the problem. And that sucks up lots of time, or people entering, some of them having familiarity, some not, and coming in, off the cuff comments. So to be able to create that dynamic where meaningful dialogue can take place and decisions can be made, I think that sort of prep work is really important. I think that's often missed because deadlines are missed, or people just don't have that sort of discipline. And that's discipline on the part of the executives as well as the board members to make sure that they, A, on one hand, create it, and B, they consume it, and then they query it so that coming in, you're ready for proper decision making. I've seen the exact opposite as well, where things are just sort of railroaded through. They're not really given options, or even worse, they're coming in, they're just listing problems, and they're asking the board for solutions. In the best scenario of leadership on the chairman level, I've seen the chairman turn to that executive and say, actually, for somebody of your stature and in your role, I would expect you to come in with three possible choices and one that you recommend and why, and then ask for my input. Don't ever walk into this room again, and just throw your problem at me, right? That's not how we work. And I learned a lot from that channel. I thought that was an excellent way of addressing it without being, too, shutting down the conversation completely. Use it as a training opportunity for that CEO to improve without any sort of ambiguity in terms of his responsibility coming into that room.
Well, and that leads me to the question, actually, and I'm going to throw this back to Irina, which is this whole notion of the role of the chair, which I find really, really interesting, because I think that can make a huge impact on the culture of that environment. whether you were talking about, giving it structure like you did, Patrick, or even the role of the chair to know each executive's or non-executive's expertise and bring people in and refer, because you always tend to get people who, like you both mentioned, sleep on the job. And actually, maybe they have incredible experience. Maybe they're a bit more introverted. And it's sometimes, if you're not careful, it's the loudest people that get the biggest impact. And that's not necessarily what you always want. So
I want to answer with a story. I was once enthusiastically sharing with a colleague who also was a head of department at her university, and it was a pretty prestigious university. So I was enthusiastically sharing how I ran this exercise on common information bias and group decision making, and everybody gets a role which prevents them from seeing which of the three candidates that are being chosen for a job is the best candidate, because each of the roles has incomplete information about their strong points and weak points. And that's done on purpose so that only via collective group discussion, you can elicit the individual pieces of information about each of the candidates and have the full appreciation of their strengths and weaknesses to choose the best. And how the pitfalls in tackling this exercise successfully really lie with structure and process, because in the absence of such, people just jump immediately to defending a particular choice with whatever information that speaks to whatever criteria that helps them defend their choice, but the choice is formed based on incomplete information. So they themselves would have wished to change that if they knew more about the candidates, but they now, coming in with their mind made up, and so they don't open up to that discussion and end up with an inferior decision and so forth. And so I was very enthusiastically sharing how this exercise helps convey the lesson of the importance of structure. In this process, you may have all the information you need at the table, but if you don't structure the interaction a certain way and pay attention to whether information gets elicited, even from members say who are quiet or on criteria that nobody seems to mention naturally, but they are important criteria and should be discussed. And this colleague says, well, yes, and that's why I never prepare my members of the department before our departmental meetings. I was taken aback, trying to understand what she means. And actually what she meant was that in the absence of preparatory work, in the absence of this kind of advanced information, and in the absence of an effort to structure discussion in a particular way, she gets to manipulate the decision of the group.
So Patrick, you talked about the whole kind of the learning of that experience with the chair and their response back to the executive who tried to drive through, who basically tried to defer making any decision to the board. So what kind of culture is it sort of best to create the best? How do you create the best culture in that situation from your experience?
Yeah, I was just thinking that, to avoid a lot of these problems isn't just about prep for a particular board meeting. It's actually the formation of the board itself, where a lot of these dynamics need to be considered. The expertise that will help you and challenge you will be engaged, incentivized. I've seen cases where board members were there and had no idea why, or their contribution was questionable, or I found out later that they were on the take in some way, or they were offering a service and selling it, or they were getting an enormous amount of equity. I found and seen certain circumstances like this that were never really tackled, because oftentimes in that case, almost everyone in the room has got some other element that's of interest to them beyond just helping the company, and that's
their own agenda.
Well, there's an agenda. Maybe there's an equity piece, and they're trying to drive for the most personal return. Maybe they're actually being paid as a consultant, and certain things that they're responsible for, they need to maintain for their own income. There are a lot of these. So selection of board members, understanding and being really clear on the role that they play, why they're there. What is the sort of comp structure that makes sense for them, that is going to allow them the freedom and flexibility to make the right choices, even if it might appear to work against, their own personal interest. I think these are really, really important to make sure that when you're walking into that room, you're in a space that's there to uplift and support the objectives of the company and support the growth and evolution of the leadership that's running the company. And so, that's diversity of thought, that's diversity of expertise, that's diversity of gender and other ways of thinking. Because you're also, what I tried to do over time, what I've learned is also trying to have that board reflect the diversity of your customer base. And that's oftentimes what's missing, right? You have maybe, okay, well, one person's finance and one guy, and I say guy because it's often guys, is marketing, and one guy is, so-and-so, or he's the biggest investor, but they're not really thinking who's representing, the voice of this entire either geography or demographic. And then the other thing is, when you have that diversity of voice and choice and expertise, that you're also not just allowing everyone to have an opinion on stuff that they don't really know about. Making sure these voices heard is important, but making sure you're able to weight that input based on that expertise is also a very particular skill.
I think what's really interesting there is that it's this whole thing of how do you encourage an environment where people challenge and debate. Yeah. And exactly to your point, quite often they are disincentivized to do that. Yeah. And there's also often a kind of culture that you're all mates and that you've got to back each other. And, it's this crew of people that if you challenge too much, then you're seen as disruptive.
Yeah, so getting somebody off a board is hard. I mean, and actually knowing when to ask somebody to step down is difficult, and having the courage to do that, and for that person also to accept that sometimes is part of the deal. I've seen circumstances where there were people there and they weren't even showing up, or they were showing up randomly, and their contribution was questionable, but the executive team, or for whatever reason the chairman, didn't have the confidence to basically say, let's actually refresh, let's freshen up this board. Let's not wait for some natural attrition through some capital event or a new investor coming in. Let's be proactive and make sure every year or 6 months we're going to think carefully about, is this dynamic working? What could it benefit from? I think many companies would benefit from doing that much more deliberately.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I've heard that a lot. You're absolutely right about how they got somebody on the board that they thought would be really impressive, and then actually they've really either not engaged at all because they're on 20 different boards. Yeah. Or they're actually really not a good culture fit. And by that I mean perhaps don't enjoy that debate. Perhaps there's a few too many egos. Irina, a lot of this, I guess, is about how do you give people permission to be challenging, and how do you reward them for that?
That's what the chair should be concerned about. The chair is a facilitator, and they need to be creative in that role. I also, as you just described some of the situations, imagine 12 people sitting around a large table and never standing up and moving around. But it's a not necessarily an accurate picture of how deliberations take place. But I think you would agree that there is space there for how board discussions take place. And Patrick,
you mean literally changing the environment?
Yes, literally changing the environment, and literally, how do you make someone contribute when they are not motivated to contribute? And I would bet that if you gave that person, if you really want their expertise and have strong reasons to believe that it will be valuable, and if you gave that person an attentive listener, a one-on-one space, you could make them speak and contribute. The question is, are you interested in that contribution? Do you want to think creatively about getting that contribution? You may know, Megan, that I'm fascinated recently by the research on listening, on managerial listening. And one of the key insights from that research is that we actually underplay and underappreciate the importance of dyadic level of interaction in group decision making, in decision making in organizations. So we tend to think of groups, we tend to think of one-to-many formats, but we neglect the one-on-one. And the one-on-one holds a lot of magic. for particular personality types. We talked about diversity, right? And then aside from anything having to do with the characteristics of a particular speaker or the characteristics of a particular listener, a significant variance in the quality of interaction, research shows, is explained by the serendipitous encounter of person A with person B. So a magic gets unlocked because of a combination, because of a particular combination of two people that happen to meet each other. So as a chair, you want to devise formats of interaction that allow to elicit the magic that you want to happen in the boardroom. And if it requires pairing people as one-on-ones and repairing them as they discuss a particular problem, as maybe they formulate, particular alternative courses of action on a problem, then that's what you want to do. And I bet it won't look very orthodox or traditional in many environments, but if that's what you have to do, that's what you have to do.
So just to clarify, you're saying that because I remember there's a piece of research on the quality of the listener creates better explanations.
So yes, so there are very positive effects of listening on the person speaking. So when we have and literally experimental evidence, when we either distract you as a listener or we don't, and you're able to deploy attentive listening to the maximum, we see that the speaker becomes more eloquent, more logical, more aware of their own ambivalences, more critical, and actually more likely to change in terms of the opinions they hold. So there are all these extremely favorable effects from just the act of being listened to. But then the other tremendous insight from listening research is in the magic of the one-on-one, and how, in order to exploit that magic, the practical implication there is you should just afford people opportunities to meet in that kind of format as well.
I'm just thinking, when you were talking about active listening, and the more you listen, the more the person explains, the more you understand. If you think about that in the Houses of Parliament, whereas I don't think anybody listens to each other at all. They just stand up and they say what they're going to say.
It's advocacy versus inquiry as processes of decision making in groups. And advocacy is wonderful, but it's done with our minds closed. And as I said, sometimes our minds are made up based on inadequate information, incomplete information. The whole purpose of us coming together as a group is to make that information basis better, and therefore our decisions better.
I love that. You remind me of a term in Japanese. I lived in Japan for 6 years, and I was involved in a lot of large group dialogues and discussions. And there's a term that they use that I've used since I've come back, and that's nemawashi, which literally means to prepare the roots. And it's basically the process of laying the groundwork, preparing the roots, if you like, before making a decision. And it's used in gardening, where let's say you want to move this shrub or the small tree from here to here. It doesn't work very well if you just start yanking at it. And this is oftentimes how dialogues and conversations take place. You just so you haven't done the work and prep to get it done in an elegant way that doesn't cause harm. And so nemawashi is literally going with little clippers, your Japanese gardener, and clipping each root delicately at the point where it still can get nourishment, but not so far where it doesn't come out. And once you make all those clips, you move it and you prepare it and you plant it so it flourishes in the new location. So nemawashi in a corporate environment or in a decision-making environment would be, understanding the dynamics of each individual that is involved. If necessary, spending the time one-to-one so that you understand where they sit. You help them provide feedback, perhaps in an environment that's not the boardroom, but in advance, even better, where you're going to know where they're going to come down and maybe influence them in a way that you'd like them to if they're not where you need them to be. so that you're walking into that boardroom or you're walking into that decision-making process already in advance, knowing which way it might go and how you might guide it, or at least you'll know where the clear divisions of thought are and how you might focus the discussion to get past that. So I love this term nemoashi. I think it's a very effective one. It does take a lot of forethought. And it does also allow you to have more diversity of thought without expecting everyone to be super outspoken or have the time to do the prep or even necessarily show up. But you're taking the time to clip that route so that when you come into the board meeting, everything moves as elegantly as it can.
It's really interesting. So I guess a lot of this I'm just sort of wondering that this whole thing about allowing this disagreement, this challenge, which is what makes good decisions, is a lot of about psychological safety, right? And it goes back to the point about agenda. Like if it is known, if the culture of that organization at that level is that it's encouraged to clip the roots and it's encouraged to put the prep and it's encouraged that you have different thoughts, then and you're kind of going to be rewarded for that. But I guess the counter is also true, isn't it? So that if there's this culture where there isn't a psychological safety, there isn't the appreciation of that difference, how do you get a handle on that, Irina?
I just want to say psychological safety is a necessary but not a sufficient condition. In my experience, actually, research talks about psychological safety as uniformly positive phenomena. But I've noticed on these types of exercises that I've described a while earlier, that sometimes that trust and comfort is exploited by advocates. And if it's exploited by advocates alone, it doesn't produce better decisions. If it leads to problem solving, to inquiry, to revisiting the basis for the judgments that are being formed, then it's a different matter altogether. So it depends what psychological safety is used for, in my opinion, and this comes from just practical experience of observing many groups deliberate over decisions, and noticing that you can be really friendly and outspoken, but if all that this does is enables advocates to keep advocating without revisiting the basis for their decisions, then it won't lead to better decisions.
That's about comfort in a way, isn't it?
Yeah, so you need comfort for both. You certainly need comfort. I'm just saying that comfort too may be misused. And to me, the healthy culture of problem solving is more about understanding the importance of the multiplicity of perspectives and diversity of perspectives for the quality of information that you're working with. Okay, the same way when we earlier discussed boards and Patrick brought the issue of the diversity of perspectives and expertise being important on the board, it's equally important for the board to be critical of the information basis of the decisions that are being brought for their judgment, being brought forward. Has that been generated with enough consultation? Right? Because our decisions are only as good as the best alternative that we consider for a given decision. And if some alternatives are not even on the table, we will never end up choosing those alternatives.
Well, this reminds me, because you were talking to me the other day about an AI dashboard, weren't you? That would basically be part of the boardroom and would give you like indications of how much you'd considered other options, what stage of the kind of the rational process you were at, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's a dream. It's a crazy dream for now. We are contemplating the possibility of using machine learning algorithms to recognize where in a decision-making process groups deliberate. Have they given attention to these various components of decision making, from goals, objectives, and generation of options, and the discussion of consequences and risks, and then if that would be feasible, then deliberating groups of individuals can have real-time feedback on which areas of the process they have visited and which remain in the dark, and at least this may suggest the need to revisit certain issues, revisit certain types of discussions, perhaps deploy different formats for revisiting those issues. And so it could be real life feedback about the process. And I care about this because, as I said, psychological safety alone, in light of practical experience, I suppose, gives me some doubts as to whether that's the sufficient condition for effective
So what
problem
is the
solving.
most, so that's interesting, and I know it's very much in development, but what is, if you could choose one thing that if you have a boardroom dynamic, a group dynamic in a boardroom, what is the one thing that will lead to the best decisions?
The very clear understanding of the objective and criteria that will be used to the evaluation of the solution that or decision that will be taken. I think that's absolutely fundamental. And actually, people having hidden agendas, different agendas, is not a problem at all. It's just that those agendas need to be surfaced in the discussion, and a common, agreed upon understanding of what we're trying to achieve needs to be reached.
What do you think, Patrick?
Yeah, I think that sounds really on point. One thing that we haven't gotten into, and I think which informs this, are also values. You know, what are the values of the business or of the founders, or that you're bringing into the room, and establishing that? Because if you don't have a clear view of those when you're a small business, good luck holding on to any of those as you grow, because it is not your choice as you take into investment who that board member will be and what values they bring into the room necessarily. And so the values you can infuse begin with you at the creation of the business or within the team. And then that also goes into how and who you choose as your board members and as your chairman. That goes into how and who you then choose to expand, and under what basis. You're right, as you mentioned. Do you make decisions? You know, what is considered you know, they say, you know, there's no favorable wind for the sailor who doesn't know where he's going. So, you know, your objectives, your what you're trying to achieve, aligned though with how you achieve that through your values, are absolutely critical. And the more you can practice doing this in a meaningful way with the right combination of board members, or changing them as you see necessary over time, the more you can maintain that over the longer period, because any new board member going to come in is going to appreciate they're coming into an established culture of decision-making and mutual respect and diversity of thought and preparation in advance. And where I've seen things go a bit sideways sometimes is, you know, that hasn't yet been established. A new investment's taken in a Series B, a board member comes in, is now a major investor, and they now set the agenda. And then that could be quite hard to rectify towards maintaining and keeping the essence of the business they invested in the first place.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think, yeah, and like you say, we're around the kind of values and the goals. There are many ways you can do that. So to sort of give yourself those kind of anchoring values is really important.
B Corp, one further thing, like, you know, setting out to be a B Corp, you know, you do have to adhere to certain sort of processes. There's another level of that where you can actually have like a golden share where you're truly aligned to a certain value system. You know, companies like Ben and Jerry's have gone so far as to make sure that even post-sale, the one thing they get to hold on to is their values around certain topics, which led into all sorts of conflict later on. But, you know, that's how, you know, they built their business. That's how they grew their customer base, how they hired the best employees. And so, you know, you can see how far that has to be infused into the structure of your business and decision-making process. But it is really important, and there are structural ways to actually build that into your bylaws that protect it, you know, for future employees, board members, and decision makers.
In terms of helping deliberations in a given moment of time regarding these shared objectives that the group of people needs to have clarity about, there is again a variety of tools. I know of one business coach, academic, Peter Hawkins at Henley Business School, offering a technique where He's asking a group of people to reflect on additional chairs they would like to bring into the room for the stakeholders who care about what is about to be discussed here now, and who those stakeholders would be. Chairs for who? So everyone generates people they would be bringing in, and that begins to inform the values, broader, higher level objectives prior to the discussion of then more concrete, goals that the group wants to achieve in that interaction. And that kind of technique can help you revisit the question in particular moments of time when you need it.
So I was just going to sort of wrap up actually, and I thought it was interesting because we talked about sort of clarity of goals being really, really fundamental. We've talked about clarity of values being a really good guiding technique, and we talked about the selection of the board members, which I think is like really important. And like you say, that's how you set up the diversity of thought and expertise and industries and that kind of thing. My last point would be, I'm kind of intrigued, Patrick, what you think about tenure, because you mentioned briefly the whole thing of refreshing the board. The thing I've seen is that people get very comfortable. Arguably, could you put together something that everybody only stays for 2 or 3 years and then you automatically refresh the board, or does that get too cumbersome?
It's an interesting one. I think it does kind of depend perhaps on the company. Where things are a little trickier is when, for example, part of their compensation or share options that have over a vesting period. And so, for them to feel they're getting the value of their time, they want to make sure they're there long enough for those shares to vest. Where I've seen the healthiest, and I think it's important to have those incentives. Where I see oftentimes a more healthy dynamic is where the people on board have actually invested themselves, and so they actually own shares. And whether they're there or not there, making that decision, they're still going to benefit from the growth of the business. And if they're able to, when the time is right, step away and hand over because maybe they're busy or they're not focused enough, or somebody else can add a different dynamic, they're going to do that with grace because, the incentive is still there for the company to thrive. And maybe somebody else can do that. So I think how you structure incentivization financially or through options or what have you can make a difference in people's willingness to engage or not engage. It's not always the case where all your board members can invest. I think it is great when there's a little bit of skin in the game. And I've seen cases where maybe you give them a good incentive to invest. We'll give you 2x the shares if you put in, a certain amount of money to make it, even more interesting for you as an extra form of compensation. So, not everybody works on that basis, but also not everybody has intrinsic motivation for, the best interests of other people. So trying to find the right balance there is important.
Some of us fear messy consultation processes, especially when they require a lot of effort. But to the extent that they help generate better basis for the decision making that happens, they also help implementation and better decisions. So just
do you mean the more planning, the more time, the more messy, the better the decision?
Yes, I'm saying that let's not be afraid of how laborious it is to prepare people and make them contribute and reflect together and not have closure for a while, to then appreciate the moments when we do have closure and implementation is easy and smooth because everybody is on board and knows what they're doing and why they're doing the things they're doing. I think that is somehow underappreciated sometimes when we talk about decision making at this level.